My name is Susan Hayward. I'm a senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at the U.S. Institute of Peace and or Berkeley File. I love being here, love being a part of this conference, so thank you, Jose, for the invitation. This panel is entitled Illuminating What's Unseen, Acknowledging and Engaging Religious Women and Youth in Peacebuilding. What we're going to seek to do is draw particular attention to women and youth's experience in peacebuilding work in Christian, specifically Catholic tradition, and in Muslim communities. Of course, the work of understanding and engaging women and youth and understanding their priorities and bringing that to the peace agenda is critical as part of the international agenda. There's the passage of UN Security Resolutions 1325 and 2250, which both seek to recognize that women and youth have been marginalized from a lot of formal peacemaking and peacebuilding work, and that they have particular priorities and processes that they bring to the work of peace building that must be incorporated, mainstreamed into the peace agenda and supported in order to create sustainable peace. And it's critical that we discuss this because I think often, and I say this as one who is a part of the religious peace building field, that often the work of religious peace building hasn't taken seriously the call of 1325 and of 2250 in really making central the priorities and concerns of youth and women. And the religious peacebuilding field has sometimes contributed, in fact, to the kinds of peacebuilding work that may have an unintended consequence of further marginalizing women and youth and not transforming and seeing as central to peacebuilding the transformation of the forms of violence that women and youth face in particularly acute ways, including, of course, sexual and gender-based violence. So the questions we'll be looking at: what priorities do women and youth bring to the peace agenda, particularly derived out of their experiences of violence? What strategies do they use, and how do they navigate challenges and roadblocks that are erected on their path, including, of course, those within their own religious traditions? And how does their work challenge or transform what we traditionally consider to be the substance or the process of Muslim peacebuilding or of Catholic peacebuilding? And in that process of both looking and acknowledging what they do, illuminating it, but also through their own processes of engaging with their religious traditions in order to legitimate their actions as peace builders within their communities and to defend it against detractors within their communities. How are they involved in the actual construction and reconstruction of religion generally, and of their religious traditions in particular? So I hope that we will be addressing this issue, and I know that we will be addressing this issue kind of through two vantage points. One is through both looking at, illuminating, understanding how women and youth in the Catholic and Muslim traditions do their peace-building work and what priorities that they bring, but then also looking at the forms of violence that women and youth face and how these traditions address those forms of violence. All leaders within those traditions address those forms of violence and prioritize them. So I am very glad that we will have today three wonderful speakers. Our first speaker will be Marianne Cusimano-Love, who is a professor of international relations at Catholic University and an expert on international security and peace building. Marianne is involved in a number of relevant initiatives that she'll draw from in speaking to us today, particularly as an advisory member of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. Following Marianne will be Dr. Aisha Kadafici, who is assistant professor of the practice here at Georgetown University in the master's program in conflict resolution, and also a founding member of the Salam Institute for Peace and Justice. Aisha will be speaking to Muslim women peace builders in particular, and I should note that both Marianne and Aisha have chapters in a book that was co-edited by Catherine Marshall of the Berkley Center and myself on women, religion, and peace building. And our third speaker will be Irene Gilson, who's an associate professor in the Department of Professional Nursing Practice here at Georgetown's School of Nursing and Health Studies, and who also teaches at the School of Medicine and the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And Irene will be speaking specifically to youth peacebuilding, Muslim youth in particular. So I will turn it over to Marianne.
Thank you for inviting me to be with you and be part of this discussion here today. And thank you for this, this topic, a great time to have it. I think as Susan's made reference to, the topic of women, religion, and peace building is often excluded on multiple dynamics, kind of 3 strikes and you're out often. And oftentimes when religious peace building is considered, it's considered engagement with clerical leaders, with male clerical leaders. So I often describe it to my friends in the State Department as, you know, the rabbi, the imam, and the bishop walked into a classroom and no consideration at all of women in religion at all. And that's really problematic for a number of reasons. So I'm giving you kind of my bottom line up front here. If you fall asleep or your coffee doesn't wears off, you've got some of the main bullet points in advance. Why are we looking at women, religious, and peace building? And certainly it's demographics. Women are more religious than men. Women are, if you want to use the military terminology, they're forward deployed. They are in areas of conflict. Sometimes they are accidental peace builders, if you will, that they are engaged in their networks when war comes to their area and then responds. Other times they are much more intentional or professional peace builders, if you will. They work there because of their mission, serving people in need, but their relational proximity gives them access to people across the conflict lines and across confessional lines as well. So they get into some very interesting places, something we'll hear from our other authors and discussants here today, that their identity and their work gets them across these lines, that gets them into some very interesting places. I talk about religious actors as having 3 eyes in world politics. They have the institutions, they have ideas, and they have religious imagination. And all 3 of those they can draw on simultaneously to give some very different outcomes and some very different approaches to peace building than perhaps more secular actors can do. And this can be a real game changer, particularly for conflict transformation, and particularly in areas where you have recurring cycles of violence, and so you need something to interrupt the pattern and bring in a different type of pattern. And so one of the challenges, though, is how can we go from this more reactive mode, the accidental peace builder, to a more strategic mode? So the demographic is very well known. Women are more religious than men by basically any study that's been done on this and different religions. So this is a real resource to bring to bear in peace building. So I often challenge folks who are doing religious peace building and are doing that kind of traditional engagement just with the male clerical leaders, that if you're just engaging the male clerical leaders, you're doing it wrong. Okay, you are leaving most of your resources on the table untapped. And that's particularly true when you look at who is there in war zones, who is responding, who are the first responders to victims of conflict, and who as well are receiving, on the receiving end of that conflict. So they are able to do what John Paul Lederach talks about in his work as being that missing middle of peace building between the grassroots and the very elite levels. And they're able to navigate across those lines in ways that allow them to be much more strategic than you might imagine. So they're working very creatively in the front lines. They're bringing these relational networks and skills, pastoral skills, to bear. They're both ministering to the communities in need, but they're also doing preventive work. So they're working really in all phases of the conflict. They're doing conflict prevention. They're doing mediation when conflict breaks out. They're doing post-conflict reconstruction, reconciliation, transitional justice type work. And they're doing it really in a very holistic way, interweaving these things in the type of very practical activities that they're undertaking in order to make their communities more resilient. And they approach, one of the things Susan talked about is what's the difference in the way they approach these issues? Are there certain aspects of violence that they're looking at that are sometimes more overlooked? And that's absolutely true empirically, that we find them looking at issues of sexual violence, looking at issues of mobilization of youth and the concerns of youth that are often looked at as the luxuries in peace building. Like first you get the parties to the conflict to sit down at a peace table and come up with an agreement. Then you deal with the needs of the combatants to demobilize them. And then after you get that real important stuff done, maybe you'll address the issues of women and youth and restoration and reconstruction. And that is not how the women approach this. They start absolutely at the other end of the spectrum. I'm going to give you a concrete example. Susan asked us to give some concrete examples from our work that can give you a flavor for what I'm talking about. So this is Sister Bon of the Dominican Sisters in Iraq. And to give you an idea of some of the very creative work that women peace builders are doing in war zones. So when ISIS came across the Nineveh Plains in 2014, and we all saw the horrific pictures, they were among those fleeing ISIS with just the clothes on their back. But ISIS wasn't unknown to them. The way it was portrayed in Western media accounts, this wasn't some external actor that came swooping in that caught them all unawares. These were people they had relationships with, people who had studied in their schools. They had birthed these boys as babies. They knew these families. So it was a double issue for them. They felt a sense of personal betrayal of the folks that they had been in relationship with, but then also these decisions to make as they fled the advancing ISIS forces. They also didn't know whether to stay or go because there had been previous periods of violence, and they had effectively negotiated with Daesh, with these members, to spare them, to spare their communities. These were things that were kind of sudden interruptions, but they didn't think that this was going to be as bad as it was. They had been repeatedly displaced by the conflicts in Iraq, so they'd fled Baghdad to the Nineveh Plains. They'd had their convents destroyed. So again, it wasn't the way it's portrayed that everything had been fine until ISIS came. They'd been impacted by these previous cycles of violence. When they finally decided to flee, because they were given warnings by members of ISIS, that this time you really need to go, sister. When they decided to finally flee, it was very, very difficult. They were, like all of the other internally displaced persons and refugees, caught in this human flow, a journey that would take about an hour to get to the Kurdish areas where there was a bit more security, took over 18 hours. They just had the clothes on their back, had nothing else. They immediately, like all of the others, were taking solace in the churches, on the gardens, in the grounds, just this huge human flow. But what was different from the approach of the sisters, so there they are themselves, IDPs, refugees, fleeing violence. They immediately commandeered a couple of tents, from the Peshmerga, and set up a mobile medical clinic because people were dropping over in the heat from exhaustion, anxiety, heart attacks, strokes, without their medicines, etc. So they immediately started mobilizing to do ministry to their fellow displaced persons. They also then continued with that, trying to advocate to get housing that was more permanent beyond the tents when it became clear they were not going to be able to go. And they were themselves living in these displaced communities. So they were living in, this was the upgrade to the tents, were these metal, basically like metal shipping containers. They called euphemistically the caravans, in which they were living very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter. Many of the sisters died in this exodus because of the strains that this put upon them. Very immediately, they were concerned about schools. They were concerned about when it became clear that they were not going to be able to go back. They wanted to set up schools, and not just tent schools in the refugee communities, but permanent schools, because they knew that this period of displacement could be very long. As David knows, the average period of displacement for a refugee is 17 years. And they were particularly concerned about schooling for the girls. Now, this is, again, how the strategic invisibility, how women religious can often be overlooked. They can often be looked at as, oh, well, that's just what the sisters do. They're just nurses, they're teachers, that's what they do. They set up schools. And what they were doing was trying to prevent human trafficking of these girls. They said, if we can get these girls in school, we can protect them. And right now, all of us are incredibly vulnerable for continued violence, for rape, for human trafficking, not just by ISIS, but by other forces in the area. They also, very interestingly, were adamant about sports programming for the girls, that they wanted to have soccer pitches for them, and co-educational schools and co-educational soccer pitches, which was very revolutionary when you're a few kilometers from the battlefront with ISIS. That is, all of those things are a death threat for you to do any of those types of activities. And they were very, very key on this, and they would just not take no for an answer. So when the Iraqi officials or the Kurdish officials said, can't be done, they said, thank you very much, and they figured out a way to do it. And within a year, they had an operational school up, built a school from the ground up. Before they had the newly built school, they were just commandeering buildings and getting basically some of the houses that were available that people had fled, and were using that for schools. Now, how are they baking in peace building into this work that they are doing? Well, they were saying to me how everybody was traumatized. The adults were traumatized, the children were traumatized, they'd seen things no one should ever see. So they were immediately baking in peace-building work and trying to prevent the next cycle of violence, that these children would not then be caught in these cycles of revenge and violence. So they were teaching peace education and nonviolent conflict resolution skills, but they weren't calling it those things. But that's absolutely what they were doing. Many of them had been trained through Mennonite peace-building schools and through Catholic peace-building schools and training programs. And they were doing that from the preschool on up, and with the adults that they would then bring in through parent groups and others. So they had very beautiful ways in which they would incorporate religious rites in this. So they had peace rooms in each of these places, as well as peace spaces. And they would have the children come in and pray in whatever way. They'd teach them yoga, they'd teach them meditation, as well as traditional prayers. And what they were doing with that was trauma healing. And they were also doing both construction and reconstruction of religious rights and issues, because the very reason that many of these people were displaced was some of these issues of religious identity, and their churches had all been torched. So very important to do those healing around issues of religion. And very beautiful, the things I was witnessing while I was there talking with them. One of the children in the prayer room said that they were praying about their villages back home. And of course, they all have social media, so they can see the pictures of their homes torched, of what's been done to their homes since they fled. And they said, God told me not to worry, that angels are there praying back home in our churches. So very beautiful trauma healing that was taking place, and ways to reconstruct that religious identity as not being one about violence, but being a way of different ways of thinking about it, of protection, of safety, of creativity. And they just simple art projects like this. I don't know if you can see it, but it said, my dream is to go back to my city and see my house, my school, my neighbors, my friends. So the ways in which they were using simple art projects, again, to do trauma healing and try to interrupt these cycles of violence. They were establishing trauma healing centers. Why? Because they wanted youth to have jobs so that they would not be available for recruitment by the violent actors or for human trafficking circles, again, for the girls. Also, this movement across sectarian lines. So a lot of the different activities they were engaged with, economic development activities for the refugees and displaced, absolutely working across. They weren't just ministering to Christian communities, they were ministering to all those who had been displaced. And that gave them a great deal of legitimacy. This was one of the more popular classes. The computer classes are always full because they were trying to give new skills to people who had to flee, whether they would go on to Jordan, go on to try to make it to Europe, whether they would stay within Iraq. They had left behind all their degrees, all their documentation of the skill sets they'd had before. So they needed not only to learn new languages, whether it was Kurdish if they were going to stay in Kurdistan, whether it was English if they were going to move on, but computer skills if they were a nurse or something behind. They didn't have the documentation to be able to practice nursing in the places they were going to. These were some of the other practical classes that were very popular. This is beauty and barbershop. This is baking. And you see there are women in these classes, but they're across all the sectarian lines, and they're across classes as well. Women who had been professors, teachers in more professional capacities now training as bakers, because that may be what the job market would afford them if they were going to be entering a new country. But how were they using these transnational advocacy networks to not just be engaged in grassroots peace building in the area of where conflict, within conflict-impacted communities? This is Sister Diana, who was testifying on Capitol Hill that what was occurring was, in fact, a genocide. And how did she get from the Dominican house and all the pictures that I showed you to Capitol Hill to do this testimony? It was through those transnational religious networks, not only the Dominican networks, Catholic Relief Services networks, U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishop networks, multiple networks. So she was engaged in these multiple networks, not dependent on any one of them, and that allowed her to be able to raise the voice. And basically her testimony was the front page blurb for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It was the front page blurb for the Department of State annual report on religious freedom, as well as it was key in changing Secretary of State Kerry's mind about whether or not this was genocide and changing both national and international response around that. So that's a very impactful example where you can bring that grassroots legitimacy and credibility and experience to bear internationally. When I talk about the demographics of religious groups, one of the things that we need to think about is just what that means geographically. And for Christian networks, they're a little different. The Christian band is near the bottom there, if you will, on this graph. And it has more different colored bands. So that's showing you that they are engaged across the world. These populations are more evenly distributed across countries and across regions. And that's very different from Hindus, Buddhism, where the majority of that population, the religion really never left the cradle. Islam is still 2/3 in the area of origin. Judaism is really only major in 2 countries, the U.S. and Israel, and that's what that band shows. So the transnational networks have a different opportunity to engage because they are, when I say they are in the front lines of conflict, that's what I'm talking about. So again, one of the myths is, well, Christian networks can only be effective in Christian countries. That's absolutely not true, and that's one of the reasons I use this case, where obviously Christianity is a minority religion in Iraq, but was still able to be very effective. So one of the challenges, one of the pros that women bring, they are very skilled in creating and leveraging these decentralized networks. They're well positioned to be able to engage both at the grassroots level, but also strategically. And so they were having globalized, decentralized networks before that was cool, before anybody talked about that or knew what that was. So that's a real pro, and that community of practice gives them a legitimacy to engage, and they're engaging from a different angle than others are. They're looking at that saying, whose voice is missing? Who needs protection now? And how can we, in our emergency response activities, bake into the more strategic issues? So that's how they have that potential to be that missing middle that John Paul Lederach talks about in peace building. And that's that pro, that they're able to cross between those conflicting groups and those lines. But the cons, of course, go with that as well. That is strategic invisibility that allows them to get into these very interesting places, okay, that they're often dismissed as not being powerful, and that's why they are allowed to do these activities or able to engage under the radar screen. So they are very effective at using that to be able to get a heck of a lot done very quickly. The con side is that they are often ignored by the policymakers, by the higher levels of government, because they are not seen, as Catherine and Susan said in the title of our book. They are often unseen because of that just strategic invisibility. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword. So my final prescriptions are basically to understand and honor that strategic invisibility, but we need to be normalizing religious engagement and engagement with religion, with women and youth, and we'll hear more about youth in a moment, that if we're not really seeing the female face of faith in peace-building activities, again, you're not doing it right. You're missing most of the action, most of the traction, most of the leverage that you can get by engaging with religious networks. So thanks very much, and we'll continue the conversation here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. As Susan said, my name is Ayşe Kadifçi Orellana. I'm sorry I did not bring any PowerPoints or pictures, but I'll be talking to you about my work with the Muslim women peace builders and my research in this area. As Susan also mentioned, I come from the field of conflict resolution, and I didn't start working on the issues of women and peace initially. In my work, I was focusing on the role of religion and peace building. And in my practical at work, I was usually the only woman, especially working in the Muslim world, looking at Islamic sources of conflict resolution, doing peace and conflict resolution work in the Middle East. I was mostly surrounded by male leaders. I was usually an anomaly. So that led me to look for more allies in the Muslim world. And that's how I started working with the Muslim women and their work in peace building and countering extremist violence in their communities. One of the challenges, as Marianne was also mentioning, is that when we think about religion and peace building, now we understand religion can be a resource for peace, we focus mostly on male religious leaders. But on the other side, we also talk about gender empowerment, women and peace, but the peace, women and security field is mostly dominated by secular women. Coming from Turkey in a secular context, I'm often asked, how come someone like you could be thinking about Muslim women have anything to say about peace? And isn't Islam a patriarchal religious tradition that would undermine women's rights? It is completely incompatible. So as a Muslim yet secular person who identifies with her religion, I found those kind of offensive at times, but also it highlights the importance of bringing out those voices of women that are doing this work. But especially Muslim women's work is very much under the radar most of the time. So in my work, in my current work, I've been looking at different women's groups and women leaders in the Muslim world doing peace, advocacy, mediation, interfaith dialogue in different contexts. And I just wanted to share with you some of my observations. One of the important things is to recognize that the intersection of religious and gender identities provides unique opportunities for these women that are not accessible to other peacemakers, for example, secular women or secular organizations, international organizations, or even at times male religious leaders, even from that context. One of the important things is that this intersection provides these women with credibility and legitimacy, especially their knowledge on the Islamic texts. Of course, Muslim women are not a unified whole. And in my work, I have encountered women coming from various different backgrounds and have major contentions among themselves. I just want to put that out there. But providing religious legitimacy to what they're doing is very important. And they also use the Quran, the Hadith, as well as examples, historical examples and current examples, which Islamic history is very rich. One of the things that these women highlight is that Islam itself came as a, if you were to use that word for the 7th century, is a feminist religion in the sense that it highlighted women's rights in the 7th century, which was not available at the time. The other point that they make is there are many Muslim women historically that have played important roles in public, social, medical spheres, as well as in times of war and peace since the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And they also highlight the Quranic verses and think about how patriarchy is not embedded in the religion, but how patriarchal structures have taken over some of the basic values and principles of the Islamic faith. So making that is very clear is very important for many women to empower themselves, but also being empowered by their own faith not only inspires them to do this work in peace, which is really dangerous for many of them. For example, some of the women that I work with, they tell that it's their faith that encourages and inspires this work because it's the work for God. And also framing their work within the Islamic context gives them legitimacy that is not available to secular groups. And so they, for example, Sakina Yakubi, she founded during the time of Taliban Islamic schools and education schools for girls. And one of the things that she highlighted was to convince the males in the society that the Quran emphasizes educating girls, and Aisha, the Prophet's wife, was called the mother or educator of Islam because she did put a lot of emphasis on educating girls at the time. So, and that was one way that they provided legitimacy. Also in Somalia, for example, which is not often associated with women's rights and women's issues, Asha Agi, which was one of the leading figures who started a movement called the Sixth Clan, understanding that women were a clan of their own because they were excluded by the other 5 clans that were fighting with each other, and utilizing religious knowledge that she had, and her religiosity helped her incorporate even a gendered language to the constitution that she was working on, the transitional constitution. The other thing that's really important to understand is that women's engagement, Muslim women's engagement with peace provides them with a unique access to especially women who have been negatively affected in conflict zones. So they're able to reach out to especially more conservative women where international organizations or secular groups may not have access to. They have a better understanding of some of the challenges that these women may face, from gender-based violence to other issues that are related to challenges that Muslim women are facing. For example, Fatima Bradley, she works with the women and issues in Iraq. And one of the things that she does is she uses Islamic notions of peace as well as women's issues to support rights of the woman within the community. And she has a quote saying that I didn't have to focus on CEDAW or other organizations because we all had these information and these values within the Islamic tradition as well. So I think that's another contribution that they can make. But thirdly, I think women have a unique role, especially in the Muslim communities, to have access to youth. For example, Alamin, one of the women in Nigeria, she became aware of how her son was starting to go to this new meetings, this Islamic organization, and then she realized that her son was being drawn more towards Boko Haram. Therefore, as an educator herself in her society, she reached out to religious leaders and asked them and challenged them to develop a sort of a manual that looked at the Hadith and the Quran and the peace elements in those, and then created a manual that was first voluntary, but then it became required text for some of the schools. And she even started a radio program where she would have callers calling in to talk about these issues and peace and conflict resolution. I'm using that my word, but issues of peace, diversity within the Islamic tradition with the religious leaders. Similarly, Fatima Bradley, her son was drawn into the conflict, and he actually went into the bushes in Iraq. So what she did was she went after her son and looked for her for 20 days. But she was also able to understand that people who were drawn, the young boys, were drawn. They were all were sons of other mothers as well. So while she was talking to the ISIS and members as well as the Iraqi military, she was able to find her son and then convince them and start talking about different ways of understanding Islam, and she was able to come and talk them out of that. So engaging with religious leaders is another skill, I would say, or another resource that these women have. They are able to, because of their religiosity and their understanding of religion, they're able to draw these religious leaders and challenge them using the religious tradition. And male religious leaders. And that's right. And the other thing I would say that many of them, because of their strategic invisibility, are able to not see this as an impediment, but an opportunity. For example, many of those women, because they're not perceived as a threat, and their invisibility provides them with access to certain individuals that other communities may not have access to, allows them to build bridges and link communities that are not necessarily easily linked. And so the other thing I would say is that because of their unique position in these societies as mothers, as sisters, as daughters, and because they're often, maybe it's not because of their inherent nature, but because of their experiences, they're able to understand power dynamics and work with them in ways that are really part of their strategic invisibility. For example, Asha Agi or Daka Ibrahim, they were able to understand the power dynamics within the tribal structures as well as the government, local community structures, and they were able to move around those structures in ways that were very creative. So they use a lot of creative thinking and applying their beliefs and practices. And so I would just say that some of the different ways in which women have been contributing in peace building in the Muslim world, they've been doing a lot of trauma healing with women. For example, my friend Hafsat, she herself was a victim of Boko Haram, and she has been working not only with widows, Boko Haram widows, as well as the women that have been sexually and in other ways abused by Boko Haram, but also with orphans, taking care of them and providing support socially, psychologically, and in any other way that she can think of. And she uses her religiosity to draw people and to help them transform. Prayers are one of the tools that she uses. In Pakistan, Masarat Kadim, she works with an organization called Paiman, and one of the things that they do is they work with children, as well as youth, as well as mothers who, one of the things that they've been doing was reaching out to some of the women that were doing the stitches of the suicide bombs. And they were trying to understand why some women would actually contribute to such violence. And they were able to meet with these women. And then one of the things that they did was to encourage them to use those skills to provide other forms of stitching in their communities, and they were able to convince some mothers not to do those things. And then also empowering women in terms of providing them with other social skills. And for example, Sakina Yakubi, in addition to giving Islamic education, she was also helping them build skills in resolving conflicts, understanding how to negotiate with different community members and groups, including Taliban at the time. Also, women have been very good in terms of doing advocacy work in their communities, empowering women to become more participate in political as well as other ways of enhancing their communities. And also, they've been doing, some of the women, for example, in Morocco, have been involved in transitional justice initiatives, which is not very common in the Muslim world for women, but especially in Morocco, addressing the lead years has been an important element for the women's work in that context. Just to briefly mention some of the challenges, especially for Muslim women, because their work is so unrealized or goes hidden, they do not have the necessary international support that they need. They don't always have access to other women doing different kinds of work in different contexts. So trying to link them together and to learn from each other and provide support for each other is very important. Also, they don't always have access to international finance funds and other resources that could help with their work. Some of this is because they do not know where to get these funds, but the other one is that they're sometimes suspicious, their communities are suspicious of where the funding is coming from. But it's really important, I would like to end by saying that it's really important to recognize the important work that these women are doing, provide support for their work, and at least recognize them. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay. So I'm a native Washingtonian. We really believe in call and response.
Amen.
So I have to say, I'm talking about youth, Islam, and peace, and I have to say that I am neither a youth, nor am I Muslim, but I do believe in peace. In fact, Irene means peace. Thank you. And I just wanted to comment on education by Dominican nuns. So actually, I was educated for 3rd through 8th grade by Dominican nuns of Cincinnati, Wisconsin, right here in Washington, D.C. And I didn't learn, actually, until about 8 years ago, that Sacred Heart School, located at 16th and Park Road, was actually quite well known for, at that time, being one of the first schools to not just allow for integration, but to encourage integration. And so the Dominican Sisters really were addressing both racial issues, social justice, economic justice, et cetera. So Yeah, they do wonderful work everywhere. So I'm going to talk as quickly as possible because we really would like to have a lot of discussion. So I'm going to flip through a lot of these slides. You'll be happy to hear. And hopefully engage in discussion later, but these are available if you want them. So I want to start off by saying that the work that I'll present is based on a number of studies that have been carried out over the last 3.5 years or so on youth and engagement in peace building in Somalia, Tajikistan, Tunisia, Iraq, etc. And interestingly, this is the even broader context. So much of the work, as you know, around Islamic youth has been cast in the light of preventing violence because of violent jihadist extremism. And some of us have, for several years, said, you know, if we keep talking about violent jihadist extremism, then in the first place, that's how youth will see themselves. And secondly, that's a frame that presumes much. And so if we present it and think about it in a different way, and think about it as youth engagement and women's engagement in peace building, for example, it completely changes it. So that's what we've done, and this started in Somalia. And it starts with, by the way, not asking the traditional questions that are asked of youth and parents and community leaders, starting with, well, how have you been engaged in violent jihadist extremism? And did your mom tell you to do that? No. So the work that we did in Somalia, the very first question was, can you imagine what the very first question was? So tell me, Deborah, what is your idea of peace? How do you think of peace? So it started from that premise, asking them what their concepts were, and then building from there. And the very end is, so tell me, Deborah, imagine Somalia in 2025. How is it peaceful? And what was your obligation? What did you do to ensure that? What was your family's obligation? What were your religious leaders' obligation? What was the government's obligation? So it's building up from the concept that you can actually have peace, and we all have a responsibility to get there. So that's kind of a general frame. So there were a number of, so now I'll move quickly through this. We already mentioned the Resolution 2250, so I won't repeat that. This resolution, of course, this wasn't the first time that people thought that we needed to do peace building in a broad international way. But that resolution is extremely important. And for those of you who haven't read it, we strongly encourage you to do so because it frames very, very nicely both the general principles and practical approaches to getting there. So now I'm going to very quickly go through examples of peace building in the Middle East and North Africa region. Institute for Peace, thank you very much, has done quite a bit, as has Amalu Salam, which is a really interesting voluntary organization that's engaged thousands of children throughout the Middle East. An organization called United Network for Young Peace Builders, which is really focuses on participatory linkage. It says, okay, we need to engage youth, but by the way, it's not just engagement. Engagement should lead to a marriage. So there needs to be something really permanent, explicit, clear in the process. And then UNFPA and UNESCO have been involved, example, as well. So what works? One of the wonderful things about what's been done in the last 10, 12 years is that a lot of this has been funded by international organizations, by bilateral agencies, by international NGOs, and therefore they have been evaluated. We actually have data about them. So there's quite a substantial body of literature. And I don't present this here because we don't have time, but we have synthesized evidence-based practices, what actually has worked with youth, and it's interesting to look at those. Here, we very quickly present by Islamic principles of peace, and that could be another entire panel. By those principles, what are evidence-based recommendations that relate to those principles? For example, the one on pluralism, diversity, and human solidarity, one of the evidence-based practices that really works is expanding and strengthening interreligious dialogue and contributions to community development. So actually engaging youth in the process of talking about the relationship between religion, and not just their religion, but for example, in Egypt, Islam and the Coptic faith, engaging them in discourse about how they can use that for community development very specifically in their areas, in their neighborhoods, in their broader communities, etc. Universality, dignity, and sacredness of humanity, expanding and strengthening support for human rights for all populations. And this comes through really, really clearly in much of the work that's been done. So it's not just, okay, there are these broad concepts of human rights expressed through the United Nations, et cetera, but there are very specific practical ways to assess whether or not human rights are actually protected, and not just for youth. So I'm going to pass through all of this in the interest of time. And again, this is available. So let me talk a bit about this first report on youth and peace in Somalia. So this is the report, and I'm happy to share copies. And I kind of like the story of this report. So we had a storyteller in the previous panel, and I'd like to tell a little vignette. So a few years ago, there was this question of whether or not there was interest in helping to design and carry out this study of youth and violent jihadist extremism. And I said, well, thank you very much, but no. But if you ask me if I want to do a study on youth and peace building, yes, that's fine. So it took a bit of convincing to change the frame of the question, but we did that. The study was supported by the World Bank, UN Somalia, and UN Habitat. We interviewed, did individual interviews and had focus groups with youth and parents and community leaders, religious leaders in 2 areas in Somalia, and posed the questions as I described them previously, and engaged the youth in actually analyzing the data with us, and issued the report on National Youth Day this past spring in Somalia. And it was a kind of classic World Bank report, and we talked about how to make it more interesting. So we talked about blogs and then said, no, we're going to tweet this. If a certain well-known person in the world tweets a lot, including policy, then we will tweet this. So we captured some of the key findings and issued tweets on National Somalia Day and National Youth Day. And we thought, okay, it could be that nobody would be interested. Within 2 days, there were 1.3 million tweets about this report. And there's a lot of discussion about it now. And one of the sort of consistent comments that people have made is, oh my goodness, youth as agents of peace, Somalia. That's the first time that I have heard the words youth, Somalia, and peace in the same phrase. What does that tell you? It says that this is possible, and that actually people shouldn't be surprised. So I want to close with the words of the youth. So these are just a few of the quotes that we have, some of my favorites. These are all from these youth in Mogadishu and Afghani. So justice is the mother of peace. Isn't that wonderful? Justice is the mother of peace. We are talking about justice so much today because I feel that it is very much lacking in our society. Our communities suffer so much from the lack of justice. In my life, I have never been at peace. Violence in my community seems to be standard. On the other hand, a peaceful society is a secure society. We talked quite a bit, the previous two speakers talked quite a bit about security and how important that is. And in fact, youth in Somalia mentioned over and over and over again how fundamental security is for them and what this means for them in terms of peace. And by the way, in contrast, they talk quite a bit about violence. Not just physical violence and sexual violence, emotional, psychological violence, neglect, abuse by humanitarian workers, which we now know from reports from the British Parliament is rather prevalent. And interestingly, for those of us involved in this study, it wasn't just the young girls who talked about violence. The young boys talked about violence against women and violence in their families. And they said, please, please do something about this violence, because this impacts on all of us. As one woman said, for example, I think peace building starts in our homes and with our families. This is not something that should be seen as coming from NGOs and the government. It's personal. And in fact, and we don't have time to discuss this, but one of the surprising, for some of us, and very consistent findings was honestly the lack of trust in NGOs on the part of the youth. They said, okay, everybody thinks that NGOs are so much better than the government. Maybe not. The NGOs may be about bringing in money for themselves, and they're not really in touch with society. They seem to have ideas that come from outside, so we don't necessarily trust them. You talked about art and the involvement of art, both in terms of what women do generally and what the Dominican Sisters do. And the art, the use of creativity was really consistent through all of this. And there's some wonderful examples. There are a number of theater groups that the youth have started themselves. And again, this is not coming from the outside. These are the youth creating their own theater, their own art. For those of you who know Somalia, you probably know that poetry is really revered. Maybe that's why as an Irish American, I'm so attracted, so we love poetry. So there's a really strong belief that you can express yourself, your ideas, your aspirations through poetry. And so they're trying to regain that because some feel that it's been lost a bit during the violent times. The other thing was actually kind of giving back. So one consistent theme was that, and again, these are young people, some of them with very little education themselves, but they see the children, in particular homeless children, street children, as urgently needing their support. So it's a kind of zakat, a national zakat, or giving back. That if they see children who aren't educated, they'll educate them. Now, we're not talking people with a degree in education. We're talking young teenagers helping children to really do the best that they can with as little as they have. So these are using very little resources except their own resources, their own goodwill. And that's it. I just wanted to end by saying this theme of giving back, of feeling responsible oneself for peace and for the future is, we're finding this now again. We're just finishing the report on Tajikistan. That's coming up again. This is a very different country with different experience from Somalia, but it's coming up again. We're finding it in Iraq. And one of the things that we see is that people will come back and say, thank you so much for asking these questions in a different way. Thank you so much for not assuming there were violent jihadist extremists. Thank you so much for asking us about our role in peace and what we believe is possible for peace. And thank you so much for asking us about the future, because it's not just the here and now, it's what we can aspire for the future.
Right, thank you to all of our speakers, and let me pull out a few of the salient points that I heard. One is the reality of women and youth often operating under the specter of certain stereotypes that can constrain the work, but that they also might use in ways that are creative. So particularly for women, the stereotypes of women as non-threatening or as invisible that allow them to gain access to certain spaces, but then youth is facing kind of a polar opposite in terms of being seen as a threat to security and to the security of the state in particular, and targeted in particular ways as a result of that. Of course, the reality, as presented by our speakers, is that it's more complicated on both sides, that youth are also contributing in powerful ways to peace building, but that can be overseen. But also that women, and this wasn't touched on as much in the presentations, but I think we can talk about it as well in the discussion. Women, of course, can be a threat to the state as well, or to forms of political and social violence. And so I would be curious to hear from all of you about how you see the engagement. We're focusing on youth and women who are engaged in peace building, but how you see these women and youth peace builders also engaging with crossing the boundary to engage with women and youth who are involved in either nationalist projects that are exclusionary or violent movements themselves in ways that are effective. There was a theme of the grassroots work. Can you hear me now? All right. There was the theme of the grassroots work that women and youth are involved in, and recognition of that work, but also I think sometimes there can be a focus on their effectiveness within local communities in a way that can actually kind of constrain them, their authority and their effectiveness to the local, and not recognizing the ways in which they also transform state and religious and other forms of more elite institutional power. And so also recognizing their effectiveness in advocacy, both at the national level, but at the international level. And I appreciated your illustrations of that, Aisha and Marianne, in doing that. There's the focus on cross-boundary work, and the desire to engage across sectarian divides, and the reality to engage across sectarian divides in all these contexts. And I see that as well over and over again with youth in particular. I do a lot of work in Myanmar, and it's often the youth who are at the front lines when there's these sort of anti-Islamic or other kinds of exclusionary movements that are happening. It's the youth who are often the ones who are coming together and responding far more quickly than some of the religious leaders are doing. But I often, and there's the relational aspects of it, there's the fact that they might not be at the heads of their religious institutions or other kinds of institutions that free them up to be able to do that kind of cross-boundary work that otherwise might be seen as impossible or as risky to do so by institutional leaders. But I also see it as being as much about the pragmatic, right? So as groups that are marginalized, have limited social political power, they have to create these networks across different lines of difference in order to have more social influence, social visibility, and political power. And so, yeah, there's the relational aspects of it. There's the solidarity and seeing the forms of violence that are being felt by women or youth within these different communities that brings them together. But there's also just this sort of almost realpolitik, pragmatic, advocacy-oriented reality to it. There's the consideration of state and political forms of violence in their peace-building work, but then also these multiple forms of violence that all three of you spoke about that go beyond just recognizing the violence that's being inflicted and legitimated by the state or by groups that are trying to usurp state power. So seeing as well sexual forms of violence, trafficking and exploitation, and domestic forms of violence as forms of violence that need to be addressed in terms of peace building, but also is deeply connected to some of those state and political forms of violence. And so you can't address any of these these forms of violence in a uniform way. You have to see the ways in which these forms of violence mutually form one another and have to be addressed in a mutually formative way in order to achieve peace. And then the use of creative processes, art and rituals, as was talked about by all, and also the ability based on the reality of needing to sometimes do this work using limited resources in order to do so, in order to make it happen. There was the theme of the transformation of religious narrative and identity that drives overt political violence, which I think is a theme that we hear about, whether you're talking about male religious leaders or female religious leaders or older religious leaders or younger religious leaders. There's always this need to address, challenge, transform some of the religious drivers of conflict, including forms of religious identity that are exclusionary or forms of religious narrative that legitimate violence. But at the same time, there's also the attention to challenging and transforming different forms of religious legitimation of violence against women or against youth, or forms of religious narrative and practice that can marginalize those voices or constrain their authority or their dignity. And so you have a little bit of a twofer, right? And the religious narratives that they are using in order to do their peace building work, and at the same time defend their agency as peace building leaders, as youth or as women, can help with transforming these religion and reconstructing religion in particular ways. And they draw from their religious traditions and historical examples and so on in so doing. And then finally, there was the focus in all three of your presentations on psychological care and on emotional care as being a core aspect, as central to the work that youth and women bring from the Catholic and Muslim communities to peace-building work, and linking that kind of psychological or spiritual care to forms of bodily care and security provision. And I think I want to also draw out, Irene, from your presentation, the focus on justice as being so central and important to youth's work on peace building. And I think as you were saying that, I was thinking of some forum that I have been in where there has been talk about how what has led a lot of young people to become involved in some violent movements has often been at core a concern about justice, a concern about what's happening in Syria and wanting to do something about it. So also that same zeal and concern for justice is what can draw people towards peace building if they see effective methods for using nonviolent or peaceful means in order to do something about injustices or corruption that they're seeing around the world. So let me, before I open it up, let me just take the moderator's privilege of asking a couple questions. One is getting back to if you can share some examples of how women and youth peace builders are engaging as well across the divides within their own constituencies. So women who may be involved in violent movements or lifting up very exclusionary nationalist ideologies. And then two, I would love to hear you reflect a little bit on authority, on how these women and youth who are engaged in this peace-building work, how their work is constrained by authority, how they defend their authority, how they claim it, how it's challenged in their work. So feel free to take one or both of those questions.
Plunge in. the first one on the divides within their own constituencies. So saying that they have access to these transnational advocacy networks is not the same as that they're always, in 193 countries, 8,000 different national groups are always going to be able to mobilize or use that potential well. And certainly in some areas, in some conflicts, they're able to do that better than others. And that can depend either on their own resources, whether their own communities are split along the levels of violence. So some examples I think of from the examples I was referencing in the presentation. I asked the Dominican Sisters and many of the women religious that I was interviewing in Iraq, you hear a lot from Christians, often external to the area, that the Christian community was abandoned. This is a narrative by the Peshmerga, by the Iraqi government. No one stood up for them when ISIS Daesh came across the Nineveh plains. Therefore, the only response is to create Christian militias, and that's something you hear in other places too. And the response I heard across the board from the women religious was, rather than starting from a religious narrative, was starting from a very practical narrative. That's a terrible idea. We know these youth, they're not going to be good fighters. They're going to be outgunned. The folks on the other side have been doing this forever. You would just be slaughtering the next generations. That's just a terrible idea. It wouldn't work practically. Now then, once they got your attention, they might then otherwise give you religious narratives and other narratives. But they're very, very practical in their responses to try to diffuse violence and those narratives that can arise. Where they were very successful, what I saw with the sisters in Iraq and others, was that the violence helped to bring them together. And they all said this, it brought them together across internal Christian sectarian lines, and bringing together Yazidis and Muslims, etc., across other confessional lines. That was not the case in next door in Syria for a variety of reasons. And we had a lot of internal fighting within the Catholic faith of different groups. So the Jesuits, who had been, many of them had been murdered in the violence. Some leading Jesuits were much more critical of the Assad regime. And some religious sisters were saying, well, we had it better under the Assad regime than others. And so there were disparities in how to respond, and then that limited their ability to be as effective in access to transnational advocacy networks and the ability to work together. So there's not a one-size-fits-all, and I'm not saying that women religious have some magical ability to overcome all conflict, but they do have some unique resources that they can bring to these, and starting from that more practical element can help them to be able to sidestep some of that ideological. How the work is constrained by authority is very interesting. They're just very interestingly able to engage. They say, my authority comes from God. My authority comes, I've made my, I talked to some incredible Cabrini sisters engaged in anti-human trafficking work in Palestine, in the Sinai Desert, against these terrible criminal gangs, and that had put them at odds with their own government. One sister, her citizenship had been revoked by her own government, and had death threats against her, and she was just nonplussed by any of this tiny little nun. And she said, what can they threaten me with? Death? She was just like, don't they know I've long ago given my life to Christ? That's, they don't have anything on me there. I'm not afraid of death. That is a resource, that they can bring to bear in their work. That's not fake. You can't fake that kind of thing. That it is just untapped by folks from secular sources that can't, I think, realize the way that vocation motivates them to do the work, continues to allow them to do the work, gives them a different set of resources to bring to that work, even in times of great danger. So Sometimes they're opposed to authority. Sometimes they're just working very creatively. They have a very long-term idea of authority, like this will come to pass. We've seen this come, we've seen this go, the work continues. So they just have very creative ways of navigating this, that because in some ways they don't have a stake. They're not trying to become the state. They're not trying to be the new authority. And that gives them a creativity in their response to that.
I would just add that, for example, in the case of I think differences between Muslim women are sometimes very stark as well. For example, in the case of Pakistan, when Musarat and her organization Paiman was working with women who are more support of more extremist attitudes and organizations. So one of the things that she told me that they do is first reach out and try to listen, try to understand why are these women doing what they're doing. Sometimes it's to support their children. Sometimes it is because they agree with the values. But one of the things that they do is try to find and develop a counter argument based on the religion. So they use the arguments that they're put forth against their work and argue back against it. And so they try to do that, but they also try to build more common ground on common interest, shared values that is beyond those divisions. But I would say the biggest challenge is not between women who are more religious and less religious or have a different interpretation of the religion, but women who are secular and women who are religious. So I think the division between secular and religious women have been more challenging in my work. We did some work with USIP in Iraq on this as well. Even the religious women from... So secular women, yes, I do consider myself a woman of faith and secular, so I have to make that clear. What secular women in these contexts are usually those women who seem to be anti-religious and do think if you come from a religious background, especially as a woman, you're not smart enough, or actually the Turkish conception is like you have cobwebs in your brain kind of attitude. So there's this serious animosity from the people who define themselves as ultra-secular towards women who believe in God or believe in their faith traditions. So bridging that gap has been harder in my work. In general. In terms of authority, I think it's one of the things that we see, because the women understand the challenges in their communities and power structures, they operate within that context more or less. But any time that they are perceived as a challenge, they face physical, political, social, even cultural constraints and oppression. Many women have been actually imprisoned. In the case of Wajir in Kenya, one woman's family were killed, all members of her family were killed. So it's not because of, it's not without any challenges or risks. But I think, like Marianne was saying, their faith continues to inspire them. Their belief that they're doing the right thing for the sake of God, for the sake of the betterment of their communities has been a driving force. But for example, in Wajir, what they have tried to do is to operate within the power structures without trying to challenge them so much. And at times they sort of own their traditional gender roles, which can be a challenge. And it's not always necessarily helps improve their status in the society. We talk about practical, strategic needs of women. So there's a sort of a paradox there. But I think eventually, for example, in the case of Wajir, they informed the government authorities everything that they were doing. They work with the tribal power structures, but they were eventually able to get one of the elder women to become member of the elders committee. But it's just it's a lot of balancing act, and I don't think it's the best for the conflict resolution peace world, but that's what they're dealing with. I mean, we're experiencing it in the United States. When power structures are challenged, people can become very defensive.
No. So I'm just going to be very brief in my response so that we can engage folks in the audience. And see a couple of things. One is with regard to engaging others and going across boundaries. I'll give very specific examples from Somalia. So of course, usually there is not so much multiple religions. It's clans and tribes. And so the youth, it was fascinating actually. They were very, very well aware of course, the history of clans and tribes and the impact of those. and of colonialism and how that in turn impacted on the clans and tribes. But they're seeking at the very local level and going beyond that. And they talked over and over again at how important it was to see commonality as youth, as Somali youth. And by the way, not making a distinction between genders, but seeing themselves just as Somali. If I could go to your second question on authority, which is really important there, and then significant not just in Somalia, but we've seen in all of the countries in which we've done this work. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was just so soft-spoken. Sorry. The issue of authority is so multifaceted because within the family, it has to do with household structure and gender roles in the family, in the community, which means, for example, in the case of Somalia, clans and tribes, and the political system. So and the imam and the religious system. So what we've seen is that they're saying, okay, we understand there's this authority, we have to pay attention to it, but in a way, maybe we don't. We'll create our own authority, our own moral agency. And we know from the imam, for example, that we're supposed to be peace builders, and we're supposed to be engaging in zakat and in support for those who are vulnerable, etc. But we'll do this because we're not given many resources. So you know what? We're just going to do this on our own. So they are uncanny in their understanding of which NGOs, for example, are trustworthy and which are not. And then I'd like to sort of add something that seems a little bit out of left field, and I apologize for the baseball analogy, and that is social media and authority. So we haven't really spoken about that. So social media is both an advantage and a disadvantage with respect to peace building. So as we all know, it's been used to promote violence here, may I just say Charlottesville, and in many other countries. But it's also an extraordinary vehicle for engaging youth and women across the boundaries that we've spoken about. So there are youth in several of the countries who have thought that they kind of are the only ones really involved in creating theater, and they're sort of own in doing it, and then they'll discover, oh my goodness, in a bordering country or thousands of miles away, there are youth engaged in peace building who are also doing theater and using art as a mechanism for peace building. And so Institute for Peace and UN and other organizations that help to engage youth across these borders play a really important role, and so does social media. So I think if we recognize both the negatives of social media and also say, okay, how can we use it? Because the youth are already doing that.
Let's open it up. And I have to apologize because I thought we had until 1:30, but we have until 1, I was reminded. So I didn't leave as much time as I had hoped. But let's collect a few questions.
You're going to need 10 minutes extra.
Okay, thank you, Jose. So let's collect a few questions so we can get them all. Why don't we start here and then move back to Auntie?
My question is, firstly, a little remark. Turkey has good examples because you have one prime minister, woman prime minister, Tansu Çiller, and one internal minister of internal affairs, Meral Akşener. Also, she's head of the opposition party. And my question is, during the recruiting women in ISIS, and what's the role of the woman for recruitment process for ISIS or other extremist groups?
We're going to collect questions, Aisha, so we'll come back. Oh, sorry. Right behind you.
Thanks very much for these three fantastic grounded presentations and very thought-provoking as well. My name's David Toombs, originally from Britain, spent 13 years working in Ireland, now in New Zealand. It seems to me a significant context at the moment in terms of peace-building debates is there's an increasing focus on the significance and value of faith-based and religious approaches to peace-building. And there's also more attention to sexual violence in conflicts. And there's been some work done linking those two together, the faith-based religious responses and the sexual violence. And it's in that context, my questions to you. What are the distinctively difficult things in relation to religion for faith-based groups to address in terms of sexual violence? And conversely, what are the particular strengths and potential of a religious contribution on sexual violence?
At risk of waking the baby, sorry. Thank you very much, and to Dr. Hayward and Dr. Marshall for advancing and sustaining this conversation and facilitating this, and to all the panelists. My name's Negar Abai. I'm with the PIES of the United States. And it seems to me that there's a piece of this that's about participation of women and youth, what they bring, the obstacles, a whole host of questions there. And then there's also the approach and what it offers that is maybe even beyond women and youth as particular demographics. And I'm wondering whether maybe in part to allow for more conversation between the secular and the religious, but also just more influence on broader discussions around peace and security, whether what you think about more work that can be done to conceptualize, without essentializing, but to conceptualize what is offered or characteristic of some of these approaches. And in particular, I was thinking whether you see value in drawing some connections with, for example, the Constructive program of Gandhi and King. And in particular, I'm thinking a common strand here is the coherence between means and ends, and a kind of politics that takes that seriously and what religion offers there. So when one takes very seriously the inherent oneness of the human family, the dignity and sacredness of every individual, and also the project of building an alternative and not just dismantling, then what's allowed there, and in terms of strategies, in terms of approach, everything. So that was a thought.
Thanks, Susan. I'm Antti Pentikäinen, and I'm Reconciliation Director of the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, and writing a book at Princeton now. I have 2 footnotes and 2 questions, Susan, maybe you allow. The footnote, first, Irene, I loved your case of Somalia, and it reminded me of the Day of Forgiveness they had in June this year, where with $30,000 they launched a locally owned campaign that involved about 30,000 people on the street, so $1 per person for a day, with the cost efficiency, having all TV channels promoting peace in Somalia. So if any one of you want to hear more, I'm happy to tell. Asha, I loved your way of sharing other people's stories and promoting other people's works, which reminded me an idea, because we have a problem. We pick people out of the context, we make them speak at the stages, and then they lose this connection. We should have the power of the numbers. So we need projects where we empower a bigger number of women actors to speak for themselves and still remain relevant and return to their context. My question comes first to Marian. You mentioned the letter exhibition middle and still women being unseen or youth being unseen. I think our problem is that we don't generate the pathways to power. Some of you said they don't necessarily want it, but that is a problem. We should be much more practical in showing what is the way the power can be shared. We got Aisha mentioned that women became a tribal elder in where we spoke, Marianne, a few years ago with the Libyan women. They were leading the drafting and implementation councils of the tribal elders, but there has to be a way to power. And my question, following Susan's questions on challenging authority, because people coming within community are in huge risk, as you mentioned. So the lessons learned of the protection on this very vulnerable position, who is collecting that, who is helping, how do we understand, how do we protect people who are putting their lives in risk?
So, the current project I'm working on is looking at Boko Haram, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, and how intersection of religion and gender impacts. And one of the chapters that I'm focusing on is the why do some women join these groups? One of the interesting things that I find in the research that I'm doing is especially ISIS has a very gender-sensitive recruitment strategy that is very aware of the different gender dynamics. And so the women there's one of the things that they recognize is to establish a state, a caliphate, you really need to get the numbers of the women join. So they made a particular effort to recruit women in there. And also Boko Haram has been their reasoning is a little different. One of the reasons that they try to recruit women is because of a strategy. And the more a woman can be there, being non-threatening, provides them access to certain areas, which make them a good resource for these organizations. But one of the things that's interesting about ISIS is that they had a magazine called Dabuk and Rumia, and in that magazine they have a section written by women for women about women in Islam and from their own understanding of Islam, obviously. So they have been able to, and they have a different strategy for women, young women in the West and women in the Muslim communities. If you look at their recruitment strategy, that's very intersectionally aware of different needs of these women. For example, they sort of recruit women from the Western context, referring to the ideas of adventure, romantic love, among other things. But in the Muslim context, they talk about empowerment, and the traditional conception of gender roles that they articulate is interpreted as empowering them. So they sort of, for example, give a higher role to the mother of an ISIS baby and who's also a widow of an ISIS warrior. So that person has a different kind of authority, but their authority is defined within the very narrow traditions that I understand. So in Boko Haram, Hafsat, my friend, was telling me why some women joined. They were kind of, one woman told her that the Boko Haram men give me foot massages and brush my hair. Kind of was a very weird, sort of you wouldn't expect, but there are different ways of this romanticizing some of these men. But also older women have different reasons for doing. For example, women have been very much involved in recruiting younger women into these. And I think rather than trying to understand all the push and pull factors, we really need to understand it at different age groups, different locations, and different reasonings for each woman, and draft a strategy to respond to those accordingly.
Can I just add briefly to that? So one of the things that
And please, while you're doing that, add anything else in response to the questions and any final points.
Okay. One of the things that we found is that their strategies are brilliant. I completely agree with you, and the data really show that. And they're also very specific to the context. So it's as you indicated, Muslim women in certain areas, and specifically within Tajikistan, for example, within regions of Tajikistan. So the strategies are very specific to the different regions, which are themselves very different. Oh, I'm sorry. So their strategies are very, very specific. It's brilliant, actually. And we could learn from that. We could learn for being contextually and culturally and age, et cetera, specific. Did you have any answer?
Do you want to answer any of the other questions or add any final comments?
Yes, participatory approach. I'm sorry. We have time to answer one of them. Is that what we're saying?
Answer a couple of them.
Okay.
No time. Don't worry. We were given a grace period by Jose.
Okay. So perhaps in addressing the participatory approach and so forth. So this is engaging youth specifically and women. There are many different approaches that have worked. We said there's some quite good evidence about some of them. The question is how to keep them engaged, because one of the issues, and both of you have addressed this, is that it's not just justice, although that's a very important part of engagement in peace building, but it's, for heaven's sakes, they're lacking basic resources. They're lacking education. That's why these teenagers have to go into the streets and teach their homeless children. They're lacking health services. They're lacking water. So it's really what we consider basic Maslow's hierarchy support, right? So they can't get all of that through peace building. it's wonderful that they volunteer, but there needs to be so much more than that. And what some of the groups are finding is, okay, they'll be engaged, they'll do all the wonderful arts programs and so forth, and then what? Then when are they going to have a roof over their head? They've got high school education, wonderful. When are they going to have the job? When can they do family formation, which is so important? How can they start a family if they have no job, they have no resources? So then it's going back to asking the basic questions.
Yeah, I wanted to address both Nagar's question about the coherence between means and ends, and David Toombs' what's a distinction, or what's the faith-based approach to sexual violence. And it also ties, I think, into the pathways to power point. It is that the way these women religious approach these issues is very holistic. And that's very different sometimes from the secular NGOs that would be addressing religious violence. So actually, I've sometimes had discussions with women from the secular NGOs say, oh, well, the Catholic groups are doing nothing on religious violence, I'm sorry, nothing on sexual violence in country X. And I'm like, who are you talking to? Because but the difference is they're not going to be putting up their name. We are the Center for Sexual Violence. That is not the way they're going to approach it. And that's because they're looking very holistically at the whole human person. And I talked to these women about this, and they said, we are more than the worst day we have ever suffered. And to identify a woman who's been a victim of sexual violence as only being about that worst day is to diminish her personhood. So that what they will do is they will set up centers for education or health care, and then they know what communities have been impacted by sexual violence, and once they get them in the door for those other purposes, they will address those other concerns of sexual violence. But they will never re-traumatize and re-stigmatize them by naming the center that, or naming the work about that. So it's very holistic. And it's also very empowering, saying to the women themselves, you are more than this harm that has been done to you. And you are about the resilience that remains in you, and your dignity has not been diminished by the sins and violence of others. So it's a very different and a very empowering message. And they see this quite clearly as the pathway to power. Why are they starting with education and healthcare? Because knowing those are the empowerment for women and girls of the next generation. Those are the pathways to power. And without access to healthcare and education, they will have no access to power. So it's very strategic in terms of how they can position these women and girls for better outcomes in the future.
Just as long as a core component of that would also be acknowledgement of the harm that was done. So never, while not identifying them solely with the experience that they had as victims or survivors of violence, also the recognizing that and acknowledging the suffering that was done on them, so that the holistic approach doesn't diminish this trauma that was experienced by them or render it invisible. The other thing I would say in response to, if I can, just by way of closing myself, I think also there is a great deal in religious traditions that is drawn on that in subtle and overt ways contributes to a rape culture, a culture in which women and children and other vulnerable communities become the targets of sexual violence. And so I think a faith-based approach to addressing sexual violence, what it can bring distinctively is taking seriously the religious stories, the religious teachings, the religious elements that legitimate those kinds of violence, and that address often some of the religious stigmatization that happens to survivors as well. So women who become impregnated because of rape might be ostracized from their religious communities, aren't allowed to participate in sacraments or in other religious ritual traditions, which ends up stigmatizing them and creating further harm. So a faith-based approach also creates opportunities for ensuring that kind of stigmatization doesn't happen and challenges it. And then addresses as well what we were talking about in terms of the holistic approach of recognizing trauma, psychological care, spiritual care, as well as the bodily care, the care for health, the care for education, and then the transformation of the state. So transformation after sexual violence, a peacebuilding approach to sexual violence that is faith-based would ideally also take into account that kind of a holistic approach for the needs of survivors and for the transformation of perpetrators as well. So thank you to all of the presenters and to all of those here, and I hope we can continue to talk about some of this over lunch. So lunch is from 1 to 2, and then we regather, right?
Yes,
It's right out there
we'll meet for the final session.
for the final session. Thank you, everybody.